The following program is produced by Project Bait and does not reflect the views of this station.
This is Mark Wells with part one of the Wells Report on Afro-Latinos for My People. Today's report was influenced by a number of factors, which I will mention in no particular order of importance. The first was an essay I read by hip-hop activist and journalist Rosa Clemente. Clemente's essay was entitled, "Who is Black?" And she was inspired to write the piece after an African American had told her that she was not black and that Puerto Rico was not part of the African diaspora. Clemente is of Puerto Rican descent and grew tired of consistently having to explain why she sees herself as black. Her blackness is often questioned by African Americans who have lighter skin than she, as well as Latinos who are darker than she. The second inspiration for this report was a piece written by labor activist Bill Fletcher Jr. Recalling a conversation he once had with the late NFL legend and former executive director of the NFL Players Association, Gene Upshaw, Fletcher was reminded that black players now made up only about 10% of Major League Baseball. Other inspirations for this piece include the recognition of the 2009 Hispanic Heritage Month, which will have already passed by the time this segment airs, as well as a recent CNN special entitled Latino in America. One might ask why I'm doing a feature on Hispanics and Latinos on an Afrocentric show. Well, anyone who has seen this show for the past few years know that I like to expose our viewers to issues, populations, and subject matters that many of us don't necessarily see as part of the black experience. But in relaying news from an Afrocentric perspective, we must realize that the full story of the African diaspora must include not only the United States, but also, of course, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and even parts of Asia. Today, there are more than 450 million people living in Latin America. But how many of us know that of those 450 million people, about 150 million of them are black Latinos? I feel the necessity of speaking on this because in many parts of the U.S., there is a divide and even conflict between black and Latino communities. And many African Americans don't seem to recognize that many Latinos are of African descent. I remember back in 1998 when I was watching the sports segment of a news program with this young lady, also African American. It was the year of the great home run battle between St. Louis Cardinals slugger Mark McGwire and Chicago Cubs outfielder Sammy Sosa. It was near the end of the season, and Sosa had hit 2 home runs in one game to pull ahead of McGwire with only a few games left in the season. When the reporter interviewed Sosa and he began to speak with his Spanish accent, the young lady said to me, "I wanted the brother to win, but he's a foreigner." Sosa is from the Dominican Republic, and although anyone could look at Sosa and see that he was of African descent, the young lady, like many African Americans, didn't see Sosa as a brother. I asked her if she knew that the main difference between Sosa's ancestors and her ancestors was that the slave ship bringing African slaves to the New World dropped his family off in the Caribbean, while her family may or may not have been dropped off in the United States. Now, if she's African American, why would I say that her ancestors may or may not have been dropped off in the United States? I'll explain that in a minute. First, let me remind our viewers that the history of native-born black Americans in the United States and black Latinos are inextricably connected. Many African Americans seem to believe that only African Americans were victims of the transatlantic slave trade that shipped more than 20 million Africans to the New World. But in reality, only 4% of the African slaves shipped to the New World were sent to the United States. The other 96% were sent to Latin America and the Caribbean. In fact, in some Latin American countries, the enslavement of Africans began many decades before it started in the land that would become the United States. Now, going back to the sister who didn't see any connection with Sammy Sosa, I said that her African ancestors may or may not have been originally shipped to the United States. The fact is, although some of our African ancestors were shipped to the U.S. directly from Africa, it is also possible that our ancestors were originally slaves on Caribbean islands like Cuba, Jamaica, or Haiti before being sent to the United States. In fact, in the colonial era between the 18th and 20th centuries, thousands of Caribbean slaves were sent to areas in South Carolina and New York. Approximately 20% of South Carolina slaves were sent from the Caribbean in the 18th century. Going back to the 18th century, the majority of slaves in New York were sent from Jamaica, while enslaved and free Haitians arrived in Louisiana in the early part of the 19th century. Truth be told, by that time, the United States was actively importing more slaves from the Caribbean than those sent directly from Africa. This is important to understand because over the years, I've heard many African Americans say things about blacks from the Caribbean or black Latinos that signaled a very limited understanding of the African diaspora and our connection to other African descendants around the world. Which brings me back to Bill Fletcher being told that black baseball players represent only about 10% of all Major League players. Anyone who has followed Major League Baseball over the past few years are familiar with star players like David Ortiz, Manny Ramirez, and Pedro Martinez. It's not hard to tell that these players are of African descent, but because they are Dominicans, they are counted as Latinos. So it's not that there are few black baseball players, it's just that many of them were born in Latin America and have Spanish surnames. So let us all realize this. If varying degrees of brown skin and curly hair, along with the history of slavery, racism, and social stigmatization are what defines a person as black, there are about 150 million people in Latin America and the Caribbean that can stake claim to this identity also. This is Mark Wells, and this has been part 1 of the Wells Report on Afro-Latinos for My People.
If you are in business, you should promote your business in the Metro Business Information Guide. For more information, contact Chris Woodard